Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of air safety and your own personal safety, we ask that you keep a close watch on your carry-ons and personal items.
Welcome to the AeroExploration Podcast, where aviation's past, present, and future meet. We explore the stories that build aviation history, take you inside the industry today, and uncover the career paths and innovations keeping the industry in motion. We go behind the scenes, into the cockpit, and onto the ramp, meeting the people and discovering the places that define aviation. If it's part of the flying world, you'll find it here. This is AeroExploration.
Welcome back, everyone, to the AeroExploration Podcast. My name is Jim, and I'm your host. And on today's episode, we're going to be diving into one of the most important regulatory shifts in general aviation in years. That's right, we're going to be talking about MOSAIC. So I've been studying MOSAIC quite a bit in the last few weeks as I work towards that final check ride for my flight instructor rating. And as I've looked through it, I've had some points where I've been frankly confused myself and had to do a lot more digging to really understand the meat and potatoes of MOSAIC. I want to be able to go into a check ride and not have just read and been able to just take in the information, but I also obviously need to be able to present this in a somewhat coherent manner. So I figured what better space to do that than a podcast with twos of listeners. So I'm going to cover all things MOSAIC here. If you feel like I've got something inaccurate here, I would love to hear so in the comments. I'm not saying that I'm perfect. I've just done a lot of reading on this in the last few weeks, and this is my understanding from that research and reading. All right, so MOSAIC itself, what does it actually stand for? MOSAIC stands for Modernization of Special Airworthiness Certification. Now, I know that sounds like a mouthful, and you might be thinking, an episode about regulations. Wow, so thrilling. But stick with me on this one, because this one might actually affect what you personally can fly, both now and in the future, depending on your medical situation. So think about it like this. A sport pilot-rated individual being able to step into a 4-seat retractable gear aircraft, or a private pilot choosing a modern light sport eligible aircraft when they're not able to necessarily maintain their medical anymore. That's exactly the kind of scenarios that MOSAIC is going to make possible. All right, so what is our roadmap here for how we're going to break this down? First, I'm going to talk a bit about the history. How did we get to MOSAIC in the first place? After that, we'll talk purpose, such as why the FAA and the industry feel that this change was necessary. Then we'll dive into what these major changes are, what differences are there for pilots and for aircraft owners. And finally, we're going to focus on the distinction between sport pilot rules and light sport aircraft rules, because there is a difference here. And I want to clear up some of the confusion surrounding these changes, because frankly, this was one of the sticking points that I had when I was reading this and going, why the difference is here? We'll talk about that. So with a flight plan clearly laid out for this episode, let's dive into all things MOSAIC. All right, to start to understand MOSAIC, we have to rewind the clock back to 2004. That is when the FAA first introduced the Sport Pilot Certificate and the light sport aircraft categories. The goal here was simple, and that was to make flying more accessible. Lower costs, shorter training time, and fewer medical barriers for individuals who may not be able to go through the full route of the FAA medical certificate process. So the light sport aircraft category came along as a companion to that. Smaller, lighter aircraft that were easier to build, own, and operate. According to that original 2004 final rule, light sport aircraft were restricted to 2 seats, fixed landing gear, a fixed pitch propeller, and a maximum weight of 1,320 pounds. This setup worked for many recreational pilots and flight schools, but over time, those limits started to become restrictive. Aircraft design, propulsion systems, avionics, and materials were all advancing. Owners and manufacturers are looking at these rules and saying to themselves, why can't we fly something a little bigger? Or why can't we have more capable aircraft under these rules? I mean, there have been a lot of advancements since 2004 in a lot of those technologies and spaces within the aircraft manufacturing community. So the industry groups like AOPA and EAA, along with kit builders and flight schools, started to ask the FAA those questions about modernization of the category. In July of 2023, the FAA published the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking for MOSAIC, which essentially outlines potential changes to both the sport pilot and light sport aircraft frameworks. So over 2 years, they have public comments, they do consultations, and they work on refining these rules. The FAA finally unveiled the final MOSAIC rules at AirVenture 2025. As the FAA noted in their announcement, this was the largest expansion of light sport aircraft and sport pilot privileges in 2 decades. EAA and others have called it Light Sport 2.0 or LSA 2.0, and AOPA has described it as modernization designed to keep light aircraft relevant in the 2020s. Okay, so why now? Why is the FAA acting now on these regulatory changes? Well, there's a few reasons here. As we have seen in this industry, innovation has outpaced regulation for a while now. Aircraft design and technologies have advanced beyond the original LSA definitions. So these modern aircraft end up being heavier, faster, but they can be still safe to properly certify. There's also a growing want and need within the pilot population itself. The GA pilot population has been aging for some time, obviously, and MOSAIC is going to help attract new pilots by allowing more flexibility, more aircraft choices, and modern training options. So let's talk about those training options. With MOSAIC, schools can start to offer aircraft with better capabilities for instruction, reducing costs, broadening the fleet options, and Flying Magazine reported that MOSAIC could significantly enhance the utility of light aircraft for training purposes. Another reason is safety and performance-based rules. Rather than relying strictly on weight and fixed gear limitations, MOSAIC can shift towards performance-based criteria, which makes a lot of sense given the advances in aerodynamics, materials, and propulsion that we've seen in the light sport aircraft space. So in short, the industry and the FAA recognized that small aircraft in the light sport category needed modernization, both to support these innovations and to provide more training and operational options for pilots. So now we understand why they are doing this now, but what is the purpose behind MOSAIC in the first place? So let's dig into the why behind these rules. At the highest level, MOSAIC is all about more choices, more capabilities, and more accessibility without compromising safety. That's an important piece here. So from the pilot's perspective, especially those who are sport pilots already, this means more aircraft that can fly, more utility from those aircraft, and fewer regulatory barriers to actually get into the cockpit in the first place. Now, if you're a manufacturer or an aircraft owner, it's going to open the door to innovations in alternative propulsion systems like electric and hybrid engines, retractable landing gear and constant speed propellers, which were previously off limit in light sport aircraft, and simpler certification pathways. The broader goal here is to grow the pilot pipeline and make light aircraft more relevant in modern aviation landscapes. For you CFIs or aspiring CFIs, this means that your future students may be flying different aircraft, and you are going to need to guide them on new endorsements and operational privileges. One important note here is MOSAIC is not a free-for-all. This doesn't eliminate rules. Safety standards are still intact, and it just updates and modernizes what those rules are in the first place. You as a pilot are still going to need endorsements for night flights, retractable gear flights, and constant speed propellers that are being added under these rules. There also, with some of these, is going to still need to be medical compliance. So though a driver's license will suffice for your sport pilot flying needs, it will not work if you want to use some of these expanded areas, such as the night flights. So that's where a medical or a basic med is still going to come into play. You also are going to have to adhere to VFR limitations for sport pilot privileges. So while MOSAIC is going to open doors, you still have to walk through them properly. All right, so next let's get into the major changes for pilots and aircraft. What's new, what's different, and what do you need to watch out for? This section is the real meat and potatoes of MOSAIC, and probably why you're listening to this podcast episode in the first place. So let's talk about what's changing for pilots and the aircraft, and we're going to start with the pilot privileges, especially those light sport certificate holders now, and then move into the aircraft certification updates. So first off, under MOSAIC, sport pilot privileges are expanding in a way that we haven't seen before. All right, so according to the FAA's final rule published on MOSAIC in July of 2025, here's what pilots can now do effective October 22nd, 2025. All right, sport pilots. What is the requirement for you to earn a sport pilot certificate and the things that haven't changed under the rule? You first off have to be 17 years old. You still have to be able to read, speak, write, and understand English. And here's the thing that's different from a private pilot certificate. You can either hold a medical certificate or have a valid U.S. driver's license. To be able to get your certificate, you need a minimum of 20 hours of flight training, including 15 hours with an authorized instructor, 5 hours of solo flight, 2 hours of cross-country training, 10 takeoffs and landings, and then you need long cross-country of at least 75 miles with full-stop landings at a minimum of 2 points, and one of those segments of the flight has to be of a straight line distance of at least 25 nautical miles between takeoff and landing locations. You'll also need 2 hours of flight training in preparation of the practical test and ground training from an instructor or a home study course. So what's changing here? Let's talk about that. Aircraft types. You can fly airplanes, gliders, weight shift controlled power parachutes, balloons, airships, and gyroplanes. The rule here is the same as before, but it's adding helicopters with simplified flight controls. Also within the aircraft space, before the rule was you could have a 2-seat aircraft. Now it can be a 4-seat aircraft. There is, however, a catch here. Just because you have 4 seats in the aircraft doesn't mean you can now take 4 passengers. The rule for amount of passengers on the aircraft remains the same. You can have the pilot and 1 sole passenger in the aircraft. All right, so max takeoff weight for the aircraft. Before, there was weight limitations associated with that. Those are now gone and replaced with those more performance-based criteria that we talked about. So let's get into that performance-based criteria. Before, there was a max stall speed of 45 knots calibrated airspeed without flaps. Now that rule has changed in airplanes to be 59 knots calibrated airspeed without flaps. There was before a max airspeed of 120 knots. That is now gone. There is no restriction in that any longer for the pilot. We'll talk a bit about max airspeed for light sport category aircraft when we get to the whole aircraft section, because again, this is different. We are still talking about just the pilot and what you can fly as a sport pilot. For engine type, it used to be single engine. Now there are no restrictions on that, except you can't have rockets for some reason. Propeller, before it was fixed or ground adjustable propellers. The new rule adds for the addition of you've got fixed, manual, and automatic pitch control. But with airplanes that have controllable pitch propellers, you will be required to have additional training and instructor endorsements. Now, from how I read this doesn't read any different than if you were a private pilot who was trying to fly a constant speed or more complex aircraft. You're still going to need that additional training and instructor endorsement. Landing gear. Previously, fixed landing gear. Now we have the addition of, you can have fixed or retractable, but again, retractable is going to require additional training and instructor endorsement. Simulator training credit, before there was none. Now you can get up to 2.5 hours of aviation training device on a certified training device, not just your Microsoft Flight Sim at home. Here's another big one, night flight operations. Sport pilots can now operate at night, provided they receive training and get endorsement. You also need to hold a valid third-class medical certificate or meet basic med requirements. AOPA highlighted this as one of the biggest practical expansions of privileges since the sport pilot certificate was created. Your medical requirements for a sport pilot. Before, the rule was state-issued driver's license and never been denied a medical by the FAA. Those rules now are still the same, but we add in basic med and a third-class medical if you want to fly at night. I want to highlight here that some limitations do exist. I know I talked about it already, but I want to just make sure that these are not forgotten. And those limits include that sport pilots can still not fly IFR under the sport pilot privileges. You are still restricted to VFR operations. And this also includes if you are a who is now going to let your medical lapse and you're going to fly under the sport pilot privileges, you cannot fly IFR while under sport pilot privileges. The next part is that your passenger limit continues to remain at 1. I don't know the full logic behind why they didn't expand the amount of passengers you can have. However, that is the rule as it is in place today. So you, under sport pilot privileges, are still limited to just 1 other occupant in the aircraft. And the other big limitation that we talked about is with night flight, and that the medical rules for sport pilots are really important here. A driver's license is going to suffice for that daytime VFR, but not if you want to get an endorsement for night flight. You still need either basic med or third-class medical, a valid one at that, and not something that has lapsed or has expired. You're flying still on the active medical or basic med. So lots of words I just said all about the sport pilot certificate itself. So again, this is the individual we were focusing on here, the pilot themselves and what they are now able to do as far as what they can fly. There is a difference between that and what the changes are for light sport category aircraft. So let's dive right into that. Once again, we see here that the FAA is shifting from these prescribed limits of weight and airspeed and all that stuff to more performance-based standards. So here are some key changes for the aircraft certification of light sport aircraft rules. So aircraft privileges. Before, the rule was that light sport aircraft were used for sport and recreation only. The changes to that rule now are, it's still the same, sport and recreation, but we've added on personal travel and some aerial work. Our maximum amount of seats has increased here, like we talked about with the sport pilot privileges and what they could fly for aircraft. It's the same here. It was 2 seats before. Now we've upped the aircraft to being able to have a 4-seat aircraft under light sport aircraft. Max weight, that has been done away with, as with the sport pilot privileges. There is no weight restriction. We revert again to those performance-based standards. So what are those? Max stall speed for our aircraft before was 45 knots, no flaps. Now under light sport, we have 61 knots calibrated airspeed with your flaps extended. So it's a higher airspeed here. Gliders are 45 knots indicated with flaps extended, and weight shift control aircraft are 45 knots indicated airspeed without flaps. Let's talk about airspeed. So for your light sport aircraft, previously 120 knots was the maximum airspeed. That has been bumped up to 250 knots. Engines here is going to be the same as with the sport pilot certificate. We're going here to any number or type of engines except, again, for rockets. I don't know what they have against rockets. I think it could be a lot of fun. Propeller, we go from fixed with the old rule to any type of propeller under the new rule. Landing gear can be either fixed or retractable under the new rule, which is a change from just fixed before. So the changes with the light sport aircraft itself don't come into play at the same time as the light sport pilot certificate rule changes. So that was October 22nd of 2025. The certification changes are going to take place 365 days after the final rule was published. So that means that will come out around July of 2026. This is going to give manufacturers and standards committees some time to adapt to the new changes. All right, so now let's cover some areas of confusion, specifically some that I had as I started going through MOSAIC, trying to wrap my head around all of this. So while light sport pilot rules and light sport aircraft certification rules are related, they are not necessarily the same. Again, the sport pilot rules govern what the pilot themselves can do, your operational privileges, endorsements, medical options, and your passenger limits. The certification rules govern what the aircraft itself can do. So maximum seats, your stall speeds, cruise speeds, gear, propulsion type, etc. So why does this matter? Just because an aircraft is certified under the new light sport standards doesn't mean a sport pilot can automatically fly it. Likewise, a pilot can fly some aircraft previously outside of that category if they meet performance criteria and have proper endorsements. So let's talk about an example here. You have a 4-seat aircraft that can now be certified as light sport because it's 61 knots of calibrated airspeed for VSO. But a sport pilot can't fly it under the sport pilot privileges because VS1, or the no flaps stall speed, is 59 knots. So why the difference here? Well, it's because sport pilots are considered technically less experienced than private pilots. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I know a lot of sport pilots who've put in a lot of hours. However, the training on its face and what is required to get your private pilot certificate versus your sport pilot certificate are just frankly different. So there is a difference, small as it is, just a couple of knots. It's meant to be a safety buffer, ensuring that they're not flying too close to aerodynamic limits of an aircraft. So MOSAIC here intentionally creates this gap between what the aircraft itself can actually do and what the pilot can legally do, balancing innovation with, all right, so you're a private pilot and you're asking yourself, why would I voluntarily shift to sport pilot privileges or fly light sport aircraft under this when I can already fly larger and more capable aircraft? Well, the answer comes down for you to mission, cost, simplicity, and flexibility. If you're flying mostly recreationally right now, maybe you can deal with flying with just one passenger VFR daytime operations. Then light sport aircraft under sport privileges might give you everything that you're going to need at lower cost, fewer hassles, especially with your medical, and still with the high quality of avionics and systems. According to AOPA, one of the big benefits for private pilots is that the sport pilot route allows you to avoid uncertainty of dealing with the medical process. It gives you simplicity of just using your driver's license as your medical certificate. And innovations under MOSAIC means more light sport aircraft will qualify, meaning you aren't limited to those 2-seat ultralights, but you might be able to rent or own your own aircraft with 4 seats. even if you're only carrying one passenger. That's still going to give you more versatility, more useful load you can carry, things like that. Yet you can fly under sport pilot privileges because it fits your mission and your budget, and it just makes sense for you. So the decision here isn't about capabilities alone. It's about whether that extra capability is required for what you do, or whether you're willing to bear the costs and complexities, or is sport pilot privileges going to accomplish your goals? All right, so let's tackle some questions that pilots are asking from some of the boards and Facebook groups that I've seen. So private pilots flying under sport pilot privileges. Yes, this is a thing that you can do. The way that this reads is starting October 22nd, if you hold a private, commercial, or ATP certificate, you can opt to exercise sport pilot privileges on eligible aircraft. However, you have to comply with those operational limits like passenger count, VFR flight only, and those stall speeds that we talked about earlier. If you want to fly other category of aircraft, you still have to first meet the requirements of that certificate that you hold. The big place this would come into play here is if you are a private pilot, you haven't had your medical revoked or denied, it's going to lapse and you no longer want to go through the process of trying to get basic med or trying to get an actual medical certificate. You can revert to having sport pilot privileges under that certificate with no additional training. As long as we're talking about the private pilot and above looking to exercise sport pilot privileges, let's talk about if you've already earned an endorsement, is it going to apply within the sport pilot privilege area? So let's take the example of you're a private pilot and you have a complex endorsement. So the question is, can you now, under sport pilot privileges, because sport pilots can technically fly complex aircraft with an endorsement, will that endorsement carry over? The answer to that is yes. You might be wondering about the night flight portion because sport pilot requires to have an endorsement and basic med and a medical to fly sport pilot privileges at night. So the night flight training that you have received during your private pilot training will qualify you to fly at night as a sport pilot. And there's a but here. As mentioned previously, the rules for flying at night as a sport pilot is still going to require you to have a valid medical certificate or be flying under basic med. So those rules still apply. It's just the training and experience that you have as a private pilot has already happened for night flying, and you don't have to redo it to get an endorsement to fly as a sport pilot. But again, just keep in mind the medical rules that are going to be at play here for flying at night under MOSAIC. Another big question that I've seen coming up is insurance changes. And I can see where that would be a concern of now you're trying to fly more capable aircraft. What is insurance going to say about that? Well, industry sources have told AOPA and AvWeb that flying eligible aircraft under sport privileges generally is not going to disrupt coverage. But you should always verify with your insurer before you take on that risk. All right, so let's tie all of this together now. We've talked about the history of MOSAIC, why it came about, and the expanded privileges for sport pilots, and the new flexibility in light sport aircraft certification. Here are the key takeaways. MOSAIC is a landmark rule that modernizes light sport aviation while keeping safety front and center. For those sport pilot certificate holders out there, you are looking at the opportunity to have more capable aircraft, expanded endorsements like night flying, retractable gear, and constant speed props, and more training options than ever before. For aircraft certification, light sport category has moved from weight-based to performance-based standards. So aircraft can now have 4 seats, retractable landing gear, alternative propulsion, and so much more. That is going to allow for more innovation within the space of aircraft certification and manufacturing. But this part is crucial. The difference between pilot privileges and aircraft certification still matters. So I hope you've been paying attention to the points that I brought up here as far as what those differences are. Just because a plane is certified under the new light sport rules doesn't automatically make it flyable under sport pilot privileges. So you've got to check the stall speed thresholds. You have to make sure you're looking at your endorsements and training and what is your certificate privileges going to cover. So what can I do now with all of this great information? Sport pilots out there, start identifying MOSAIC eligible aircraft that you want to fly, and then plan endorsements for night flight, retractable gear, and constant speed as it is applicable to you. And then find an instructor for yourself and start working towards being able to fly under these new great MOSAIC rules. Private and commercial pilots, now is the time for you to look at and explore if you want to maybe exercise sport pilot privileges, and if that makes more sense for you, for cost savings, aircraft access, and convenience. Make sure to review those stall speeds and certification criteria before you take off into that space. For CFIs and flight schools, now is the time to review and revise your content. So this includes making sure that you really understand and have digested the MOSAIC changes. You've updated syllabus that you have, and you're prepared now to introduce those new endorsements for sport pilots. Your students are going to want guidance here on what aircraft they can legally fly and what privileges they will need to do so. So make sure that you're read up and able to answer those questions for your students. AOPA and EAA have both emphasized that MOSAIC is a huge opportunity, but proper planning is going to be critical for the pilots, for manufacturers, for home builders, all of it. So make sure that you do the research. Don't just take my word for it. If you think that something I've said isn't necessarily accurate, look into the rules and make sure you really understand what they mean to you. All right, final thoughts here. MOSAIC is more than just a regulatory update. It is a step towards modernizing general aviation, making flying more accessible, and allowing aircraft innovation to flourish. This is really an exciting time for the general aviation community. Sport pilot and private pilot students, flight instructors, aircraft owners, everyone here has new opportunities to explore. But as with any change, knowledge and preparation are going to be key. Make sure you do your homework here. Don't just listen to the host of a podcast. If you are going to exercise these privileges, please do your homework. Plan your endorsements, check out your aircraft, review your privileges, and talk with your insurer. Again, MOSAIC opens a lot of doors here, but we still have to walk through them safely. If you happen to find this episode helpful, here's what you can do next. Subscribe to the AeroExploration Podcast. That way, you will never miss an update on MOSAIC, and you can hear all sorts of other aviation topics. If you have an aviation topic or want to be a guest on the AeroExploration Podcast, you can reach out to me at jim@flyingmidwest.com and tell me about what you'd like to cover or what you might be able to provide to our audience as a guest. I'd also appreciate any ratings or reviews. If you enjoyed this deep dive or you enjoy the podcast in general, I really appreciate a rating review wherever you're listening to this podcast. It helps other pilots find the show and it helps to give me that rocket fuel to keep creating these episodes for all of you. Finally, if you have any thoughts you'd like to share about MOSAIC or otherwise, or you have any questions, you can email me or you can message me on my Instagram or on Facebook or any of the social medias. And all of those have the handle of @aero_exploration. All right, tons of ground covered today. I hope that you found it useful. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. This is Aero Exploration, and we will see you next time.